And welcome to the SACOG Transportation Committee for Thursday, May 2nd, 2024, the SACOG Transportation Committee. And so we're going to go ahead and start with Pledge of Allegiance. And so excited to ask anyone, I'll lead it this morning. So if you, I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Great. Thank you. Next up is roll call.
Thank you. Good morning. And just a reminder for our directors that when you need to speak into the microphone, you can just press the button, and when it lights green, you are live and being carried through the recording. And you don't need to pick it up. You can just leave it at where it's at and just move it closer to you. It should pick you up just fine. For roll call, Director Branscombe.
Yes, ma'am.
Chapman. Absent. Early for Guerrero. Absent. Howdeshelt.
Here.
Jennings.
Here.
Joyner.
Here.
Sander.
Here.
Vice Chair Gog.
Yes.
Vice Chair Lauren. Absent. Chair Bradford.
Here.
And ex officio member Aceves absent.
Great, thank you. Next up is public communication. Any person wishing to address the committee on any item not on the agenda may do so at this time. After 10 minutes of testimony, any additional testimony will be heard following the action items. Do we have some public comment?
We do have a public communication that was sent to me via email that I've been asked to read into the record. I can go ahead and do that now. Thank you. From Glenn Mendelkern. Dear SACOG Transportation Committee, I'm very excited to encourage you to accelerate implementing and offering multiple transportation modes for Sutter Health Park. Just hours after our last meeting, April 4th, we heard announcements from the A's and Major League Baseball, MLB. And MLB got me to see MB, as in Marlon Brando. I wondered if Marlon Brando could take transit to a baseball game in West Sacramento, what would be his named desire? Brando's named desire would be the A's streetcar. So please take fast, safe actions to make downtown Riverfront streetcar ready for the A's next 3 seasons. And from named desires, we can extend naming rights, a potential source of revenue. The downtown streetcar has been spoken about at recent SAC-RT board meetings. Streetcars have strong ties to Sacramento. This new version will serve modern forms of entertainment and build ways to honor Sacramento's history, especially for curious newcomers who make our area their new home base. Placer, Sacramento, and Yolo County transit providers can also play. Yolo Bus can gain more visibility and usage. Roseville Transit has its Game Day Express for Kings games. Similar services can be created for A's games. The Lewis Orlando Transfer Point has a poster enticing riders for games. When people take transit for leisure, they get a taste and imagine uses, from work obligations to more fun too. These can facilitate needed economic activities in this vicinity and peace of mind by delegating driving to friendly operators. They'll further demonstrate inter-county engagement as exemplified by SACOG. And that concludes his public comment.
Great, thank you. Any additional public comment this morning on an item not on the agenda? Okay.
There's no other public communications.
Great, we'll move on to consent agenda then. There's 3 items on the consent agenda. Does any board member wish to remove anything or have any comments or questions? Okay, any comments or questions from the public on the consent agenda?
Move consent. Second.
And no public comment.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great. Consent agenda passes. Next, we are going to adjourn as SACOG and convene as the Capital Valley Regional Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways Committee. And so we have a separate agenda for that. Do you need, I know we don't need to do roll call again. Do you need to note any changes or anything?
There's no changes to the roll call. Well, we will add Director Young, who's here for our safe board member.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Good to see you. So for, we will move on to public communications for the CVR Safe Committee. Any public communications for CVR Safe? Okay,
There's no public communications.
great. We have 1 consent item. Any board member have a question or comment related to that? Any public comment? Okay, seeing none, is there a motion?
Second.
Okay, we've got a first and a second. All in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Next, an action item, item 2, approve and release the draft CVR Safe fiscal year 24-25 budget. Morning, Barbara.
Morning, everybody. I'm Barbara Von Bechtold. I'm on the transportation team here at SACOG. I'm also the program manager for the Capital Valley Regional SAFE. So as we said, staff has developed for review and comment a draft fiscal year 24-25 budget for the Capital Valley Regional Service Authority for Freeways and Expressways, or CVR SAFE. The CVR SAFE is comprised of El Dorado, Sacramento, San Joaquin, Sutter, Yolo, and Yuba counties. And the revenues from the CVR Safe are collected through a $1 fee that's assessed at the time of vehicle registration. So for every vehicle registered in that 6-county area, a $1 fee comes from each one of those and pays for the services that are part of the CVR Safe. Attached to your packet is the draft 24-25 budget. It estimates costs for operations of the core call box system, but also the enhanced services and projects like Freeway Service Patrol, Intelligent Transportation Systems, the 511 system, Transportation Demand Management, and our Big Data project. The CVR Safe bylaws actually require that the budget be approved before July 1st of each fiscal year. So today we're requesting that the CVR Safe Committee recommends to the CVR Safe Board to approve the release of the draft fiscal year 24-25 CVR Safe budget for review and comment, and we anticipate coming back to you all in June for approval of the final budget for next fiscal year. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Barbara. Any questions or comments from board members? Okay. Any public comment on this item? Okay,
There's no public comment.
great. Thank you. Is there a motion? Okay, you have a first and a second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you. So that is it for this CVR Safe meeting. So we will adjourn and reconvene as the SACOG Transportation Committee. Moving on to our first action item, item 4, SACOG Title 6 Program Report and Limited English Proficiency Plan.
Good morning, Barbara Von Bechtold. This is my item as well. The Federal Transit Administration requires that metropolitan planning organizations like SACOG that directly receive FTA funds submit a program report every 3 years on our compliance with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. So staff has developed the attached update to our Title VI program report, which also includes a limited English proficiency plan in compliance with the most recent Title VI guidance. And it confirms that SACOG has undertaken all the steps to ensure equal access to all programs and services. Throughout the report, we've updated demographic data when it's available and all the information on SACOG's efforts regarding to Title VI and the Civil Rights Act. So SACOG has to submit this Title VI report and the included limited English proficiency plan to FTA by June 1st, so we can remain in compliance with Title VI, as well as FTA requirements, and it also helps us maintain SACOG's eligibility for FTA funds in the future. So staff are requesting the Transportation Committee to recommend to the board to approve by resolution the 2024 SACOG Title VI program report and limited English proficiency plan to meet the requirements of Title VI and the Federal Transit Administration. And with that, I can answer any questions you might have.
Okay, any questions from board members? Looks like none. Any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, is there a motion?
Move to approve. Second.
Okay, I've got a first and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, motion passes
Thank you.
unanimously. Thank you, Barbara. Next, we'll move on to item 5, approval of the Regional Transit Network. What? Christine? We need to. No.
And Christina will be right
I was
back.
like, do we need to
She-
skip and come back?
Sorry, it's allergy season.
Oh, no.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. Today we have in front of you the Regional Transit Network Plan. I'm not going to go into too much detail about the history of this. Our consultant here, Seth Torma from Jacobs, is here to give a presentation that will highlight the process that led to the development of the plan, including the interaction that we've had with stakeholders as well as the board and the Transportation Committee specifically. But just a reminder, this was the first step to implement things that came out of our Next Gen Transit study and transit plan that was adopted in 2021. One of the really important things that came out of that was the need for a truly regional transit network that complemented the existing local network that was able to facilitate movements across jurisdictional boundaries or on key corridors that connected with other transit services that were already in place, like light rail or other high-frequency service. So this is all about high-frequency, high-capacity transit in the region. And we've been on a 1.5-ish timeframe for this. One of the really important pieces here as well to note is that this is incorporated into the blueprint. This is going to be part of the long-range transit vision for the Blueprint network. So our consultant has been working very closely with the Blueprint team to get the modeling done, make sure it's in there, make sure it's reflected appropriately. So there's been a lot of coordination with that over the last 3 to 4 months, or even longer, really. So I'm going to turn it over to Seth for the presentation, and at the end we'll have an action, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you.
Good morning, committee members. It's great to see you all in person after having seen you over the last 1.5 to 2 years virtually as well. So pleasure to be here this morning. As Christina said, this is building on the Next Gen Transit Study. And this really is a regional transit network plan that identifies that first step in developing and identifying a prioritized list of regional transit corridors for future investment. The planning process is shown there. I think the important part about that, it's not just a technical process. This planning process really was built around lots of community engagement as well as partner agency input. And you can see a list there of the input that we've had and the partnership that we've had across the 1.5 and 2 year study that we've been conducting together. Christina also mentioned that our team coordinated closely with the Blueprint team throughout the process. And it's important to note that these corridors will be included in the 2025 Blueprint. So what is high capacity transit? High capacity transit makes fewer stops, moves at higher speeds, provides transit more frequently, and it does encompass several modes, light rail being one of them. Here, I think through that process and working with our partners, we identified that the forms of HCT for this plan, really bus-based or rubber tire-based high capacity transit. Whoop, I went forward about 10 slides. There we go. So that's a look at the regional transit network. This should be familiar to you. We've been presenting this and working with you and your teams on this for about 1.5 years here. You can see 3 different types there. We'll go through what those are, but there are 47 corridors identified in the plan. And these are corridors that will be delivered in years and decades to come, but it provides a framework to do so and a framework that's flexible over time to adjust for changing conditions. So a quick look at the regional transit corridors by distance. This network works together as a system. So the long distance network, which generally would be 10 to 15 miles, mostly highway based, you can see it here in blue. There are 7 corridors identified there. Those work in conjunction with the medium distance corridors shown here. There's 30 of them identified there. And then those corridors also work, those are about 5 to 10 miles in length generally. And then those also work in conjunction with the shorter distance corridors shown here. There are 10 of them. There's different service types that are identified. Service types mean what levels of transit service are we looking at. Speed and reliability improvements, which consist of, may have dedicated transit lanes in select locations, but other transit priority treatments could include transit signal priority and other treatments throughout the corridor. There's a list of them there. These are identified as BRT light corridors. There's about 7 of those, and you can see these are might include bus-only lanes for maybe some portions of the corridors, but less than half for sure. And then finally, full BRT is sort of the highest level of investment, and you can see the corridors there. There's 6 of them, and those may include bus-only lanes for more than half the corridor. And then finally, the freeway-based BRT corridors, you can see those identified once again here. Of the 47 corridors, working closely with the partner agencies, very specifically the cities, the transit operators, we identified 5 of those 47 corridors that are really ripe opportunities for near-term improvements. And in fact, after working with them, we didn't identify 5, we identified the 6 corridors that are listed here. So of the 47, these are the 6 corridors that are great opportunities for near-term investment to illustrate success in the region on improving transit corridors, improving ridership speed and reliability in those corridors. And there you can see the list there. So the next steps, continue to develop the network, evaluate potential governance options, estimate the costs, and develop funding plans for this.
I want to add just a few things. Sorry, that was the end of Seth's presentation. I think a few things to note here. We have the regional trails network that we adopted, and we've been moving forward with implementing that. I think the regional transit network is a similar sort of sister type of study to that. We need a regional strategy to encourage partners and encourage our transit providers to start investing in high capacity transit across the region that's going to be meaningful to our partners. We need something to point to help with that strategy. We are not necessarily telling our operators what they need to do or what they should do, but this is an encouragement and a strategy to get us to where we think we need to go, particularly with respect to what the vision is in the blueprint for the long range transportation network. So this is a really important thing as we start to think about funding. We went through a lot of corridors. There's 47 that are in here that are included in the plan that we believe will be truly meaningful to the communities and the riders and will help facilitate more effective transit service in the future. I think the concept of having those 6 near-term projects as well to identify corridors that kind of already exist, that have a lot of ridership, but could use some additional infrastructure improvements to get people moving faster so people could see what truly fast and reliable service looks like, to kind of prime the pump, so to speak, for future investments along other corridors. Those are really important for that. And we have started to work with not just the transit providers, but also the cities to look at what that could mean in terms of service along those corridors and those improvements. In fact, there's the potential for a regional grant actually for a federal grant program called the SMART program that would take advantage of these 6 corridors and start to look at ITS and other, like transit signal priority, technical things that can be done to help improve the flow of traffic, including transit vehicles along some of these corridors. So there's already interest in tying work to this study, which I think is really important and shows the success of something like this for the region, that people are really supportive of this and want to move this forward. So I just wanted to highlight a few of those things that weren't necessarily in there. But we'll take questions, and I'm sure there's probably many, but the recommendation before you today is that the Transportation Committee recommend that the board approve the Regional Transit Network Plan. So with that, Director Bradford, happy to answer questions.
Great, thank you, Director Branscombe.
Thank you, sir. There's a 34-page presentation that we went over in 5 minutes. I've been on a number of boards. Anytime we would address something this complicated, this matter would have been discussed for at least an hour. And I know, and I was discussing with James, there seems to be time pressure. I don't know exactly what causes the time pressure, but it's difficult. I looked at every page here. I didn't read every word, but I understood what was being said in each page. I didn't understand everything though. And it's very complex. And so does the Transportation Committee really understand everything? I know I wish I did, and I don't. That said, I will go to things that stuck out. Actually, I'll just address 2 things. One, governance. You speak to governance here, and there at beginning, I think at page 31,
there's a discussion. And is there a recommendation?
No, there's no recommendation on governance. What we ended up doing, a typical study would include governance as part of it. We felt that this was such a complex project and complex network that we were looking at with multiple providers, multiple jurisdictions involved, that we really needed to take this overall project in specific steps. So this specific project that we were doing, the contract with the consultant, was really to just develop the network and align it with the blueprint. And we will have a subsequent study to really look at governance. What they did here was set the stage for that, because we believe that's the next step that needs to come. That governance is just, here's the universe of governance that we could be looking at, that we suggest that you start to study in a subsequent phase. But that is not explicitly part of this with a recommendation, and that was done on purpose.
Okay, we'll be getting into that in more detail later. That's good. The next, you spoke to changing conditions. One of the changing conditions is that SAC-RT is heading for a cliff financially. Have you factored that in?
Yeah, great question. And certainly the world that I operate in is working for and on behalf of transit operators all over the country. And certainly SAC-RT is not in any situation that all of the transit operators have been working within, since the post-COVID
They're typical
time.
or atypical?
Typical, not atypical. Yeah. All transit operators right now are working with really several concerns, ridership decline, as well as the challenges with finding enough labor to, service the buses. This is a long-term plan. They've been included throughout that plan and planning process. And certainly as part of the recommendations that came out here, we acknowledge those challenges that not just SAC-RT has, but all operators right now, for sure.
So there's, the pressures are going to require one of two solutions or a mix. And one is going to be, on the one hand, it can be continue the subsidies at these very high levels. The other is reducing the scope of operations in order to have a budget that is easier to maintain without these subsidies. And I guess that's going to unfold over the next couple of years, because the subsidies, the Senate bill subsidies, those are 3 years beginning this next fiscal year.
The SB 125.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe we have 2 to 3 more years left of that, of the operating funding.
So there's a window in which to react to these circumstances, and how are they going to change? Will the subsidies continue? Will there be some cutbacks? It'll be an interesting thing to watch. And it's above my pay grade, because the Senate can decide if they wish to continue these subsidies, notwithstanding the heavy pressure on the state budget. It'll be interesting to see. That's the playing ground, right?
It is. I mean, I think it's also good to remember this is a long-term vision. So we're talking about the same time frame essentially as the blueprint, which is a long-range document. So there's no expectation that this is going to be implemented in the next 5 years. This is an incremental approach. There's phasing that will be involved. That's why those near-term corridors are sort of called out and identified, because those are things we could do in a cost-effective manner on existing service routes that doesn't include any service expansion. We recognize that much of this is service expansion, and in order to do that, there's got to be some fiscal constraint associated with that. This is the vision. This isn't how are we going to do it right now. We are going to, in subsequent studies, also look at more related to the costs and the actually, like, how do you do it?
And this is, again, SAC-RT is in a typical situation. And these transit plans and the systems have been built up based on a worthy desire to provide more service and the equitable service and what have you. And there's some climate situations in there, but they may not be achievable. And I just wonder about the future. I'm very concerned. I'm worried that a number of the transit operators view themselves as too big to fail. And therefore, as too big to fail, they'll get the subsidies no matter what. And will they be worthy of those subsidies? We could talk about that later.
Director-
Thank you. Thank you for the time.
If I could, Director Branscombe, so look, your points are well taken in terms of what we're talking about here, as I think Christina said, is a long-term vision, and we have some short-term financial challenges to overcome. I do want to be clear about something though, because we talk subsidies. The SB 125, even though it's spread out over multiple years, and we hope that the budget deliberations right now that preserves, you've taken action on those. Those are really kind of one-time funds, even though they're spread over 4 years, to sort of right the ship, if you will. So those are, certainly subsidies in the classic sense. It is true, though, that no transit agency in the United States, I think this is correct, operates at a surplus, right? Everybody's operating a deficit. And one of the interesting many metrics you have is what's your fare box ratio? How much are your passenger fares covering your total cost of operations? Typically between 15 and 50%, but also that is also true for all forms of transportation. And as you're going to hear about a little bit this morning, but we can get into detail, the gas tax no longer covers the cost of all the highways and roads. We have been filling general fund and all kinds of revenue sources at the federal level that are not sort of user pay or gas tax revenues. So again, I don't want to get into a philosophical, I'm just saying that we have SB 125 that you've rightly said is a one-time. And so how are we going to get through that and have a more financially sustainable? There are also just subsidies that are ongoing and that are required for them to operate a level of service. Both of those things are important to understand. And the question I think that's before you is, how do the transit operators come out of this kind of fiscal cliff scenario in a way that is more financially sustainable, still seeking some form of more permanent, operating funds, which is the case in many, many counties in our region.
And in their defense, SB 125 says, we want you to maintain service and routes. Okay, they're going to have to spend the money, but they're setting them up. They're being set up for a cliff if that doesn't continue. It'd be a problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think what they're hoping to do with 125 is to prevent the literal cliff that you just cut back all service, that you have a glide path, and you have some time, as this committee and our board has asked us to be involved in, is what's the medium-term financial sustainability strategy, right? So we're going to be coming back to you more often on this.
No, Rick, your colleagues on that board have a big challenge. God bless y'all.
I think transportation has a challenge throughout the country. And as has been said here before already, we're not in this by ourselves. And what I like about our region is we're working together to try to address the issues, whether it's under our jurisdiction or not. We are working together, and that helps us. But we work every single day on RT in order to try to make sure that we can provide the infrastructure and the financing that allows us to get off this cliff that we're currently on. That has not been our state. Henry Lee has done a great job of managing RT over the last 8 years that I've been on there. And I've seen that. We just, all transportation finds itself in this situation right now. So I just don't want to single out RT because that's not the case. But anyway, I want to get back to the regional network plan, if I will. And Christina, there was a memo that came from our public works director. And there was a concern that was expressed, and maybe some of the transportation committee members have seen that memo. You have since talked to our transportation planning director and others within that department. And I just want you to kind of give a quick update as to in regard to the letter.
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So I think there were two main things that were brought up in there that I did address in a response, and happened to actually have a meeting yesterday with the city as well to talk about this. One is, I think there was potentially a misunderstanding of how we've categorized the corridors. There's reference in there to medium priority. They're actually done by distance. So I made that clarification. So I want to point that out. In terms of the prioritization, there is tiers of prioritization, and it is true that Truxell Commerce Corridor did not make it in the top tier. But a lot of that is because in order for BRT or any sort of high capacity transit to be effective along that corridor, there needs to be additional infrastructure projects that are planned for or currently being studied right now to be implemented. Most importantly, the Truxell Bridge, which goes across the river. Right now, if you're familiar or not familiar with Truxell, it sort of bookends at the river and then up to the north. Is it Elkhorn that it bookends up to?
So, yeah.
In order to either get to the airport or get to downtown, you either need to extend the road up to the airport, which doesn't exist now, or cross over the river with a bridge. Those things are being studied right now. It's really difficult for us to say, yes, you should be a priority project right now for any sort of high capacity transit if those infrastructure improvements are not in place. But I made the clarification that just because you are not in the top tier doesn't mean we don't want to encourage you and will not support you in continuing to study those elements so that that corridor does get to the point where it makes sense to have high capacity transit. So we talked a lot of that through. You know, we helped the city of Sacramento get a Caltrans Sustainable Transportation Planning Grant to study the Truxell Bridge. We're involved on that project. We know what's happening. The important piece with that is to keep us updated because this has been built in a way, the prioritization specifically, that we can reprioritize as certain projects continue to be developed and continue to come closer to fruition in terms of key elements. So just because it's not in the top 10 doesn't mean it's not an important project. It still is on the list. Remember, we have weeded out corridors throughout the process. So if you're on this list, you're still a viable project in our opinion. It's just a longer distance view in terms of when it might be coming online because there's some significant improvements that are needed. So we talked through that a lot and had a great conversation about it. So I think that the city staff felt comfortable with how we were moving forward.
Exactly. Anything you want to add? You good? Okay. I just wanted you to be aware that if you've read this, that the city has had conversations. We understand now how things have been categorized, and that Truxell project is not in the immediate corridor, in the near future corridor. It's further back. And so as it moves further up, then that's when the opportunity for it to be addressed.
Great, thank you. Additional board question or comments?
If the electric car get more efficient and compact and people start driving those, how would that affect our regional transit?
I think, just to repeat the question, if electric vehicles
Get
get
more efficient and affordable and they're compact, you know, to drive through the city and everything and you know how we are, we like to have our personal transportation everywhere we go and I was just kind of wondering what effect would that have in the future on the regional transportation?
I think Director Gog, I'm hoping this is true. I think you're previewing an excellent question, which we are going to answer in a presentation this morning on finances and revenue sources, because I think what you're hitting on is, regardless of EV and 2035 and all those rules, the fleet is getting more efficient, revenues are falling. And so stay tuned on that, because I think Clint Holson's going to give you a presentation that will take a deep dive into this question. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah. More financial challenges ahead. Warning sign.
Okay. Looks like that's good from a board perspective. So we'll move on to public comment. Mr. Barnbaum.
Good morning. Thank you. Michael Barnbaum, and I wanted to the executive director's comments and Director Jennings' comments to stay on the task of the vision. On one of the slides, there was, I think it was the pink slide discussing the top tier corridors. I want the Transportation Committee to consider Watt Avenue as a top tier corridor, but just don't think of it as Watt Avenue. Think of it regionally, that it operates from the Elk Grove Corporation Yard as Elk Grove Florin Road to areas north of Center High School in Placer County as Santucci Boulevard in West Roseville. And this corridor could be a very great candidate for high capacity transit in that it would cross two areas that would intersect with two different light rail lines, all while traveling the corridor from East Elk Grove to West Roseville. And to take that into some consideration of having stops spaced similar to the stop spacing currently that you have in place with light rail systems, and that this would be a great way to get folks from portions of western Placer County and the city of Roseville all the way south to the city of Elk Grove and vice versa. So I think that is a good regional candidate, especially considering when you look at the slides that a lot of what you looked at
1 minute.
is cross jurisdictional services and across jurisdictional lines as well. So if you were able to take into consideration that within your motion, that would be appreciated, and look forward to having this go to the board after your vote. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional public comment on this item?
There's no other public comment.
Okay, I just have one comment before we move on. I know that one of the long distance corridors that's prioritized is State Route 70 and 99 down from the Yuba Sutter area. Very happy to see that. Kind of tying that into some of the other things SACOG's been doing with respect to toll lanes. I believe there's a regional toll lane plan that includes State Route 65, US 50, I-80. I know we're working right now, obviously YOLO 80, next project is probably I-5. I don't believe, and I could be mistaken there, any future plans for toll lanes on Highway 99? Not north, okay. Tying that into this plan, at some point, we may have a similar situation on Highway 99, at least from the 9970 interchange south that we currently experience across the causeway. Certainly not to the same extent that we experience across the causeway, but having a toll lane from at some point in South Sutter County down to the I-5 corridor in future plans, I think would really enable this plan to take better advantage of that corridor from a bus standpoint. So, otherwise we're gonna have the same situation we have across the causeway and other areas where buses will sit in the same traffic that everyone else is sitting in. And so just throw that out there as we look at regional toll plans and the tie-in between those plans and this plan. So, okay, anything else from the board? Great. So entertain a motion.
So moved. That's the motion to move this to the board.
Okay. And so we have a first, and that's a first and a second, is that right? Or did I miss it? Okay. And so all in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. Awesome. Next, we will move on to item 6, which is informational, draft vision and goals for the Regional Mobility Hub Design Guidance. Morning, Victoria.
Good morning. Victoria Cacciatore with the SACOG Transportation Team, and I'm here to update and receive input from the Transportation Committee on the draft goals and vision for the Mobility Hub Design Guidance. And I'd like to take a moment to pause. Mobility Hub, different than the Mobility Zones project. The Mobility Hub Regional Design Guidance will serve as an implementation tool for mobility zones if that is fitting with the community input that is collected through the zones. We will be bringing this item back for approval in June, and we're currently vetting with cities, counties, transit operators, and community serving groups now through late May. Our regional definition of mobility hubs is a place that allows people to seamlessly switch between transportation modes to reach their destinations. They're scaled and designed in a flexible, adaptable manner that leverages supportive physical and digital amenities, responds to local community needs, and promotes a sense of place. This draft definition was taken from our existing conditions analysis, and we've been sharing this for input with all of our focus groups and advisory groups thus far. So for today, we have been looking at how we can refine the draft vision, which is included in attachment B. If it's the will of the committee, I will read it out loud. All right. Create a network of regional mobility hubs that prioritizes people through flexible design, accessibility, and community integration. Mobility hubs will seamlessly connect two or more modes of transportation: transit, bike, pedestrian, and shared mobility. Shared mobility services and on-demand services. Through a design approach that is both context-sensitive, flexible, and prioritizes climate adaptation, the mobility hubs aim to empower individuals to move efficiently and sustainably, fostering vibrant and inclusive communities. Our goals in illustrative objectives that were just provided to offer some of the possible interpretations of how these goals would be developed to flesh out our approach to how all of the goals are interpreted. But overall, we have the goals of connected mobility, equitable mobility, and economic growth, climate adaptation, and flexible and user-friendly design. At this point, we've met with, or invited, at least all of the cities, counties, and transit operators in our region to provide input. We also have 2 additional scheduled focus groups that will be inviting people from community serving organizations that are here to represent the unique needs that people have when they are either using different transportation modes or their perception of public spaces. Those are from groups that are across all 6 counties and aiming to represent the region and all of the different people that we're able to serve. We also have a one-on-one that we are inviting SMUD to, since they are heavily involved with mobility hub implementation in our region. Our early takeaways from the cities and counties and transit operators is that we need to have a further discussion of how mobility hubs can serve areas without regular transit and have that represented in the objectives. We need to emphasize safety in the discussion, possibly to the level of adding an additional goal that is focused on safety instead of having it nested under flexible and user-friendly design. The potential for mobility hubs to support new activity centers as opposed to only existing activity centers, and also the ability for mobility hubs to serve temporal or seasonal needs, such as what you would have during harvest season at Apple Hill. We also had a comment from our groups that there is a potential for the goals and objectives to have a more proactive role in climate adaptation, perhaps also addressing resilience. So with that, I would like to open it up to the Transportation Committee for any additional thoughts that you would like to see reflected in these visions and goals, and also considerations that we should factor into the objectives that we use to quantify these goals. This item will be coming back in June after we have been able to incorporate all of the input, and we will be asking you for approval at that time. It will be different from what we have in front of us today. So with that, I'd like to pause for questions or input.
I'm trying to picture a mobility hub. Can you describe one? I presume it's where the different modes come together. What's it going to look like?
Well, it can look differently based on the different areas that they're located in. For example, we are working with Yuba City right now to develop a pop-up mobility hub, a one-day demonstration for the June board meeting when we'll be out in Yuba City. But I think that in some ways it's a more human focused, like if it has existing transit service, it can be a more human-focused transit center that also has the ability for, like, it has the supportive infrastructure for people to bike or walk safely to it. And maybe you would have a community car share there too, if it's a more rural area where transit is not as regular or it doesn't reach the same populations. For areas where they might be able to support like a shared bike share or a shared scooter share, if that's the will of the area. It could also be a place where that meets with a car share location. If you'd have a hub where you could like bring in that shared micromobility to its charging dock and then
So they'll
take
be
your
ad
car for
hoc.
elsewhere.
They will be ad hoc depending upon the specific location's circumstances. I get it.
Okay, and that is the point of this study. We recognize that mobility hubs in other areas have been developed around very urban areas. And that is not the bulk of the SACOG region. We have a lot of different communities with different land use densities, different transportation services that are available. So we're not going to be able to take a cookie cutter version of what worked in Richmond and say, we're going to put this in Marysville.
You'll be taking a station is the wrong term, I'm sure, but you'll be taking a station and looking at the circumstances around it and how it can be improved, if not optimized, for the local circumstances.
Yes, and
It's gonna be
what
interesting
we
how you do that.
what we heard is that given that not all communities that have need for additional transportation services have existing transit, and they may not be effective to serve through transit either. And as we were just discussing, there's a very challenging landscape for how our transit networks can move forward in providing the quality and intensity of service that is needed to serve different areas. So mobility hubs are often rooted in transit or anchored by a transit service, but we're increasingly looking at how you could provide other non-transit focused options that are more adaptive to the area they would serve, such as a community car share.
Director Branscombe, one in my mind that, and staff can tell me if this vision aligns with an example, a correct example of what this is, but the North Valley Rail Station in Plumas Lake in the future, right? And so there's not currently any transit service in Plumas Lake other than commuter service to Sacramento, and it's from a different location. So the North Valley Strategic Rail Plan, in addition to proposing a station in Plumas Lake, it proposes relocating the existing Yuba Sutter commuter service to be at the same location as the rail station. It would be a great place for Yuba Sutter Transit to serve in the future, and also provide, you know, a scooter share and e-bike to get folks from the Plumas Lake community to that transit station, transit center, and shuttle service from there over to the Hard Rock and the amphitheater and things like that. So really providing that connection from North Valley Rail and other transit services to other things in that immediate area. Is that a good example of what one might look like?
Yes, that would be one that's serving much larger transportation needs. I mean, if you're ever able to anchor something on rail, that's a definite opportunity that you want to make the most of. That is a much smaller subset of what we will be looking at, but it is a great example.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions from the board? Okay, any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, great. Thank you, Victoria. So next we'll move on to item 7, project delivery update and future MTIP action. Morning, Miguel.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. It's my first time, I think, presenting in person. So glad to be here. Miguel Mendoza, analyst with planning and programming, and today I'm going to go over an information item, project delivery and future MTIP actions. The overview that we'll go over today is background on the MTIP, which is the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. It's a mouthful, so I'll refer to it as the MTIP moving forward. What we've been able to accomplish in the last federal fiscal year, what we're currently working on blended with what the rest of this year will look like. The Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Plan is essentially a listing of transportation projects. There are some requirements to this document. It is federally required, developed by MPOs such as ourselves. It covers 4 federal fiscal years, so it's a shorter range plan than the longer blueprint. Within those 4 years, it must also be financially constrained. And I think very importantly, the investments that are identified in the short range MTIP must be consistent with the investments identified in the long range blueprint, as we've been calling it. To expand a little bit on that last point, what that essentially means is for a project to make its way into the MTIP, the decisions have already been made, right? So the decisions by this board or other funding agencies or bodies will come well before these projects make it in. And since it is a list of projects, there are also requirements to these projects. For projects to be in the MTIP, one, they must be within the boundaries of the respective MPO, and then in our case, it's the 6-county region. If a project is funded with federal dollars, federal transportation dollars specifically, it must be programmed in the MTIP. Or alternatively, if a project, for example, is locally or state funded, but requires federal action of some sort, it must also be programmed in the MTIP. With that background on sort of what the MTIP is, and again, this is a high-level overview of it, we'll be going back to our current cycle or iteration of this MTIP, and we refer to it as a 2023 MTIP. And we have a list here of when it was approved by the board in September of 2022, and it received federal approval of that same year. Ever since the approval by the federal agencies, we've been doing monthly administrative modifications, and then in November of last year, we had a formal amendment. The differentiator between administrative modifications and formal amendments is that administrative modifications are more minor in scope. So for example, if you have a sponsor who wants to correct something in the description, that would be an administrative modification. A formal amendment happens less frequently, and the biggest difference there is that the formal amendment will cover a change that would require a rerun of the air quality model, for example. And that normally takes in the form of a longer process than a monthly one. This chart here covers the investments identified in the current MTIP. And as you can see, half of it, approximately 1.9 billion, is federal funds. A third, or 33%, being local dollars at 1.2, and then the remaining 600 and some change million in state funding. If I could, I want to zoom in into some of these federal fundings, two to be specific, which is the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program and the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality. And I want to zoom in on these two because these are the federal revenues that SACOG, El Dorado County Transportation Commission, and Placer County Transportation Planning Agency uses for the funding rounds. And here's the process of how, when we talk about project delivery, and delivery being when a project receives federal approval to start work, to start federally reimbursable work specifically. So once the decisions are made in the funding rounds, in their respective funding rounds, the programming and project delivery team works with the project sponsors to identify timeline, descriptions of whatever needs to be in there as was awarded in the funding rounds, and a host of other details. When it makes it into the MTIP, then we have a year-by-year cycle of when projects receive their authorizations. So for example, in the last federal fiscal year, 2023, we had 38 projects deliver or obligate their funds, and that totaled to about $44 million, a combination of SDBG and CMAQ. And that list is in your packets as attachment A. Also off of the delivery in attachment B, we have a a listing of the loans that we took, or a loan that we took from another MPO. And this is a process that is allowed under our board-approved project delivery process. And these loans, when we do take them, is zero interest, 1-for-1. We would typically take a loan of CMAQ, for example, and pay back in CMAQ in a future year. And the advantage for us here is we would be able to have a project move forward that would have delivered in a later year. So we're advancing it. We're able to kind of work with our sponsors to make sure that if a project can come forward, that it will come forward. And again, that's attachment A for the list of projects and their jurisdictions, and B for the one loan that we did take last year. Moving off of the 2023 process and what we've been able to achieve, I want to go over what we're currently working on and what we'll see for the rest of the year. There's 3 major work items that we're going to be working on. One is the monthly administrative modifications. We're still doing them, working with sponsors every month to make sure that any changes that are needed are made to their projects to ensure consistency and accuracy. 2 is we're going to continue helping folks deliver their projects and receive obligations. And 3, probably the biggest one, is we are updating the 2023 MTIP for its next iteration, which will be the 2025 MTIP. The MTIP is updated every 2 years, along with all the other MPOs in California who are in the same cycle. And I'll talk about how that all gets folded in together. Here's a sort of a random slide, but I want to make sure to point this out. As part of the administration of the MTIP, as you would imagine, having 600 projects in Excel would be unwieldy. We do have a software called SACTRAC that we use to help administer the program. And we will be going before the Strategic Planning Committee on Monday to ask for a recommendation to the board to approve a 5-year contract with a software vendor for SACTRAC. And it's going to be a 5-year contract of about $700,000 with optional modules that we can include if we wanted to in the future. And I'll have a more thorough presentation on this on Monday for the committee, but all of that to say that I think if we kept track of this manually, it would be a much harder and bigger lift than having something tailor-built for this. And so here's a timeline of what we've been working on and what we'll be seeing for the rest of the year when it comes to MTIP. The updating the 2025 MTIP, as for other regions, is sort of a year-long process. And so in February of this year, we engaged the project sponsors and our partner agencies to look at their existing projects in the 23 MTIP. We asked them to update if there were any updates, or to just carry forward if there were none. At the same time, we also asked for new projects that need to be now in this 4-year period, since we are adding 2 more years to the MTIP and dropping off the first 2 years. And then once that call for projects period was done, we're currently now in the process of validating the changes that were made. We validate these projects against various lists produced by Caltrans or the federal government to ensure consistency, and also the correct data and various other details. Once we have gone through a lot of the analysis and the modeling that's included with analyzing this list, we'll have a public comment period. And near the end of that public comment period, we'll be coming back to this committee to hold a public hearing to allow members of the public to have a say in person. And of course, during the period, they also have the ability to send us written comments or suggestions. And we take all of those comments and we address them and send them for approval as part of the final packet. In September, we go back to committees and boards to get approval and adoption of the final 25, or the draft 25 MTIP rather, and the accompanying air quality conformity analysis. We submit that in short order to Caltrans, and it gets approved hopefully by the end of the year in December by the federal agencies, being Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration as well. And you may be seeing that gap there between September and December. It's a long time after we've submitted it to Caltrans to get approval. And that's because, as I've mentioned before, we're preparing this in concert with all the other MPOs in California. What this means is once we submit ours, everyone else is submitting theirs, and Caltrans will bundle it all together into what's called the FSTIP, Federal Statewide Transportation Improvement Plan. And that is what gets submitted to Caltrans, or that's what gets submitted to the federal partners for approval. And it's an effort that, as I talk to other partner MPOs, we're all going through. So we're all sort of in the same lockstep process of doing this. And this being the last slide, I just want to remind that we'll be coming back to you with action in September for the 2025 MTIP, the accompanying air quality conformity analysis, and then that last box. Because this document must remain consistent with the MTP, it is considered an amendment to it. As you can imagine, if we change something in this list, it must also be reflected on the long range transportation list. With that, I'm going to conclude my presentation and happy to take comments or questions on this.
Comments and questions from the board? Okay. Just a reminder, we do this process every other year or every year?
Correct. Every other year.
Every other year.
Yes.
Okay. Any public comment on this item?
There's no public comment.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair Bradford, I just want to make sure, I know it's a lot of acronyms and this is basically the short-term implementation plan, right? You have to be, if our long-range plan is, you're in the waiting room, you get a ticket, then you actually get in, that's the getting in to the MTIP. You have to be in this MTIP in order to deliver the project. We do it every 2 years. So you'll hear a lot more about it. But it's the short-term plan that you must be in order to advance and actually go to construction. Safe to say?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
So following up on that, and it may have been mentioned and I may have missed it. You get into the plan because you're ready to go to construction in the next couple of years, or because you have funding to go to the construction? So if there's a project that maybe is not in the, let me ask this a different way. Do you have, I know with the MTP, you have to be in the MTP to get funding. With this, if you're in the MTP, but you don't yet have funding, and then you get funding, then it put you in this plan? Or I guess which comes first, the funding or the being in this?
It's sort of both. So to be able to enter into the MTIP, you must have been identified in the MTP, either in a lump sum or as a single detailed project. And then the other requirement is that you must have secured funding for the project.
Great, thank you. That answers my question. Okay, so with that, we'll move on to the last item, item 8, 2025 Blueprint Transportation Funding Outlook. Morning, Clint.
Good morning. I'm pulling up a brief presentation here. So I'm going to just talk really high level. This is an introduction to kind of the financial element of the blueprint that you're adopting. We're going to talk a lot more about this kind of coming in August and September and October, leading up to your supposed or hopeful action in by the end of the year, by November, to adopt both a land use and a package of transportation investments for the blueprint. Just a reminder of where we're at your board meeting this month. You'll be hearing about the land use options that you talked about last month. That's coming to your board. Get your direction, and then next month in June, hopefully we'll be you'll be entertaining an action to adopt the land use assumptions. Take those land use assumptions, marry up a transportation investment package to them. But it's not just the land use that's going to govern what kind of transportation investments we can make in this plan, right? We've got to look at how much money we can expect over the next 2.5 decades. So I'm going to go through kind of what is fiscal constraint for this plan, how much money are we planning for broadly. These are preliminary estimates right now. Differences from the last plan, there are a couple of key differences, and then some options for future revenue. We do include and have included in previous plans some new revenue sources. They don't exist today. These are things like sales taxes. And then I'll go over some next steps. So on the what is fiscal constraint, it's pretty straightforward. summary of cost to operate, build, maintain, operate the transportation system. That's all the roads, the highways, the transit system, the cost to operate the transit system, the cost to replace all the vehicles for that transit system. All of that is kind of rolled up into the cost to implement the transportation strategy of the plan. Our obligation is to show to the federal government that all of that vision, all of those investments that we want, we have a reasonable opportunity to pay for that given the funding that we can expect. So reasonably available in this context, it means a couple of different things. If you're talking about the MTIP that Miguel just talked about, there's a much more tight kind of definition of what available means for the MTIP, right? You need to have some committed funding. We don't include things like sales taxes and like a Placer sales tax or a Sacramento sales tax. We wouldn't include those in the MTIP yet until we can get those passed. Then they got money, they're in the MTIP. But you can include those things in your long range plan. Is it reasonable to assume we've got public support for them? You've got political support for them. They are going onto the ballot. There's been legislation passed in Placer County. I know STA is doing a lot of work to kind of learn from previous measures to get something onto the ballot. So those are all things that if you can build the kind of the case and the evidence for the new revenues, and you can show for existing revenues, either trend lines or good historic practice, that's what you need to do to build up your evidence that these are reasonable. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through the presentation. Then we also need to identify potential funding shortfalls. I think in this plan, we've never been able to cover, say, all of the maintenance and rehabilitation needs that the region needs for its transportation system in any of our plan. And that's okay, but you need to disclose that. You need to come up with an estimate of how much are we coming up short right now. And in our region, it's a big number. It's around $500 million, $500 million a year we come up short in funding for maintenance and rehabilitation of our road and highway system. And then if we do have new revenue sources, what are the strategies to implement those? So how much money are we planning for? Your current plan, the 2025 plan, had about $35 billion in it over a 20-year period. The preliminary estimates for the blueprint, it's a little bit more money, $37 billion, but that is over a longer period of time. That's over about a 5-year period of time. I've divided it up here, the regional funding programs. Those are the things that this board makes decisions about. That's the stuff that's funded with your CMAQ funding, your STBG funding, and then as well, some state funding, the STIP funding. Today, it's actually around 6 or 7% of all the funding that comes into the region. But over time, and I'll talk about why this happens, over time, while that pot of money, well, in this case, it does grow. It is less growth than the last plan, so you're seeing a reduction, but it's also becoming a smaller share of the total expenditures in the region. And I'll talk about that. Has a lot to do with the latest federal authorization and then what's happening at the state level to the STIP. So I'll talk a little bit about what's going on there. Where all this money comes from, most of the funding that we have, or not most of, the largest source of funding that we have for transportation comes out of fuel taxes, both the federal excise tax as well as state excise taxes on both diesel and gasoline. Then we've also got sales taxes make up for a good chunk of it, about 27% today. But like I mentioned, we have a couple of new sales taxes in the measure. They don't exist today, or sorry, in the plan. They don't exist today, but those also add up. So sales taxes and fuel taxes make up the vast majority of how we pay for transportation in the region. And then in kind of local funding, that's where your developer fees are, developer agreements, exactions, things like that. General fund contributions to transportation would all be landing in there. And then there's some other funding sources that come to transportation occasionally. So differences from the last plan, I started to get to this. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, it was a massive increase in spending for transportation infrastructure. But the bulk of the increases went to competitive programs at either the federal level or the state level. You didn't see the same translation of the increase into CMAQ and STBG funding that is what SACOG board controls. Those are going up in this bill by about 2% a year, but you saw a really big increase into a bunch of these newer programs. And one thing to think about when we're talking about the investment strategy for the plan is, if the federal government is growing the pot of competitive dollars, how are we using our locally controlled or regionally controlled dollars to go and attract more of this investment, because they're not funneling more money for us to have discretion over. We're having to take our funding and leverage it against these much larger competitive programs. And that is just, it is additional money that we can absolutely claim and assume in this plan, but we need to have a strategy for how we're going to go after all of those grants. And I know you've been talking a lot about grants prioritization strategies and things like that. Those are ways that we can capture more of this funding. And we can justify that in the plan and call it reasonably available. So who decides how the funding is spent? This is always a touchy area, because yes, there's most of the funding coming to build and maintain and operate. It's locally controlled, but there's very few transportation dollars that don't come with a lot of strings attached to them. So even that locally controlled dollars, I thought it was important. It's state formula. This is the stuff that comes out of your LTF money, your STA money for transit operators. Yes, it does go directly to the local agencies and they can decide where it goes, but it's restricted, right? A lot of times it is for transit, or it is for maintaining your system. It may not necessarily be available to you for building larger capital projects. So yes, a lot of it comes from local, but that doesn't necessarily mean you can do whatever you want with it. It all comes with strings. And then I mentioned again, SACOG's kind of the share that we have in our regional funding programs. It declines a little bit over time as a total of the funding coming to our region. So that's one difference. An emphasis on competitive at the federal and state level, kind of maintaining of those formula funds. A second thing that is kind of causing those differences from the last plan is the continued improvement in fuel efficiency of the state vehicles, the fleet in California. In the staff report, I linked to an LAO report recently that is showing up to a 60% decline in some funding programs, like the STIP that comes into this region, and then we make decisions about it, part of our regional funding program. A lot of that decline is due to the Clean Cars Act 2, that is the kind of the implementation of the governor's executive order that we're going to be all zero emission for new car sales by 2035. That this reference scenario here, that is kind of without that law. You still see declining revenues over time because cars are getting more fuel efficient, whether it's EVs or you're running battery electric or plug-in hybrid type vehicles. A lot of the trips in the region are very, very short. So even if you are plug-in hybrid, you may not even be using fuel for most of your trips. You're able to use electricity. And so we're seeing a decline in fuel consumption over time, even as VMT increases, and that translates into some declines in revenues as well. But then you add in that transition to all new vehicles being zero emission or electric, and that really starts to cause a faster decline in revenues. And so these are risks. This isn't a for sure thing. Are we exactly going to follow this trajectory? We don't know, but absolutely cars are getting more fuel efficient. Fuel tax receipts are going down over time. So yeah, please.
The fuel tax is a fixed amount per gallon?
Oh yeah, so kind of. It is an excise tax. So it is a fixed amount per gallon, but it is adjusted for inflation every year. So every year that fixed excise tax in the state of California might go up a little bit. It typically doesn't go up enough to fully fill in the gaps or the declining revenue, but it does go up on an annual basis.
To what degree are you incorporating the state government's mandate on EVs in 2035?
So
I think any sensible person would think that's not going to happen.
Yeah, so the forecast that we have, so this is the kind of the reference scenario that is without that that policy. So the line in red, you're seeing,
what those were. Thank you.
Yeah, you're seeing a decline, and then that line in blue, that is what the state would expect with that law in place. And so I think that's something that we want to wrestle with and have conversation with you about. Where do we land? We know that revenues are going to go down, but where do we land in terms of the state? I think it can serve an important kind of purpose to show, if this is what the state is doing, this is what it's going to potentially do to transportation revenues, and here are the things that would have to happen in order to kind of make up for that loss in revenues. But I think that's an ongoing conversation. Right now, the decline that we're forecasting is probably right between these lines.
So I know it's kind of an unknown, so I'm guessing maybe not, but do our projections take into account what the state's doing with respect to a mileage-based tax instead of the gas tax?
Thank you for that. Good question. So, yes, but not yet. So, because so what's in the current plan and what isn't baked into those preliminary estimates are those 2 new sales taxes. Those are in there. They've been in this plan for quite some time. I've assumed that those could continue. In the current plan, we also have tolling and a road usage charge at the state level and a mileage-based pricing fee at the regional level. And I'll talk a bit about what those are, because those are also 2 new revenue sources. They are not in that 37 billion yet. And that's partially because we want to see what the transportation network is, because these are the revenues you would get from this. It's absolutely driven by how much people are driving. And so this is going to have a feedback loop with traffic that we see. So on the managed lane network and tolling, we've been talking a lot about that lane. Those are revenues that we would assume in this plan. In your current plan, the policy direction that the board gave with that, with these is all revenues generated from these toll facilities go into the financing, the cost to build that facility, maintain that facility first and foremost. That's what they're for. If there are excess revenues from that, they go back into investment along that corridor. Oh, thank you. Better? And so this is one area where we do have new revenues included in the plan, and we'll generate estimates.
New battery technology for your microphone, okay?
And then mileage-based fees as well. So this is something that we introduced into the last plan for the first time in this region. And we were cautious about how we introduced it. So the state of California is looking at a replacement for the fuel tax. They've had what they're calling the road usage charge. And they're kind of going through some piloting of different ways to do that. There are a lot of concerns about how this could roll out. Privacy concerns, fairness concerns, what does this do to household budgets? And those are all questions that the board asked last time we updated this plan. We did include pricing in the plan, both the state road usage charge, but what we included is, that would be a revenue neutral. So what the state has signaled is that they want to keep, if they do a transition, that it is essentially the same cost as what the fuel tax is now. Roughly, my numbers might be a little bit out of date now, but that's roughly about 2 cents a mile is the equivalent. It might be a little bit less than that now. But 2 cents a mile is kind of what they would maintain as a revenue neutral. And then what the current plan says is that from there, we would be able to move that number around based on regional demand, so that you could, that number might go a little bit up at peak periods on I-80 for the commute period, because you're having a larger impact on the system. But it wouldn't make sense to charge that same amount, say on a rural road at 10 a.m. that isn't having the same impact. You might be able to charge less. And so that would, what the kind of the regional layer on top of this road usage charge is more of a dynamic pricing that we can use for system management as well. So it's sensitive to roadway demand. So that is another option for additional revenue. We have a kind of a pilot, a test that we're working on right now with Southern California SCAG and San Diego to start looking at ways that this could work. But there's a lot of questions still on how this could roll out and when it could roll out, right? We're talking about a 2035 greenhouse gas target, a 2050 plan. Is it reasonable to assume that we would see a transition in this state from fuel-based to road usage charge by 2035, where we could start using the kind of the demand management aspects of a system pricing? Those are all big questions that I think we still need to tackle. Next steps, I'm trying to get through this fairly quickly. I mentioned already, you'll be considering action on a set of land use assumptions in June. Using those land use assumptions, revenue assumptions, we will build up our transportation investments. Just kind of over time, these are our previous plans from this region. What you've seen is the share of budget in the overall plan shifting more and more towards maintaining our system and a little bit away from building up the system. And that's both been a policy decision that this board has made over time, but it also is something that you see in a lot of regions kind of as they mature. You're growing very rapidly. We're still seeing that in our region, but as more areas get built out, you're spending more and more of your resources on maintaining that. So there's a natural progression there, but there's also been policy decisions in the past that are pushing more funding towards maintenance and a little bit away from kind of those larger capital expansions. As far as next steps, I went through quite a few of the next steps, but June is land use. In August, any input that or questions, feedback, concerns we get from you today, we will take that and we will use that to help us craft what we bring to you in August in terms of your discussion on transportation investment strategies, what projects should land in the plan, what our priorities are for investment categories, as well as the kind of a more detailed look at what the revenues are. In your packet, I included an attachment of kind of all of the revenue programs that make up those regional, federal, state, and local funds. I mentioned those all have strings. And so what we want to bring to you is how much kind of discretion do you have? If a lot of this funding is already earmarked for transit or it's already earmarked for road maintenance, those aren't things you need to make decisions on in terms of budget category. Maybe where that money goes, which jurisdictions it go to, which projects it goes to. But we want to give you a better idea of how much money are we talking about in terms of the discretionary funding that we have that could go to maintenance, it could go to transit, or it could go to roadway capital. I think those are all really important discussions that maybe we tee up in August so that we can have the discussions in September and October and then consider an action in November. So I'll think that's it for my presentation. This is just for next year. The reason that we'd want to get that action done by November, we can kick off developing our environmental impact report, writing our plan, and there's a series of steps that we'd be going through in 2025 to get us to an adoption by the end of the year. But I will stop there for any comments, questions, concerns, and we'll make sure we fold those up into our coming up presentations.
On one of your funding source slides, you showed future sales tax revenues or possible sales tax revenues.
Yeah.
I presume you're familiar with the taxpayer initiative that's being qualified for the upcoming ballot, which would retroactively require 2/3 majorities for sales tax increases and such. So that's a risk factor. I presume I've heard something about that being in court in terms of the quality or the wording of that proposal, but it's a risk.
Yeah.
It's a risk, but the Placer sales tax measure would require that 2/3 supermajority anyway.
It would, right? Yes. Yeah, as would any in Sacramento County, a new one in Sacramento.
Properly worded, they only 50%, only 51%.
Yeah, and then I think also important note, a change from the previous plan to this plan for the Placer. In the previous plan, we had considered it a county-wide. Now it is Lincoln, the county, not the county. I can't remember all three. It's 3 jurisdictions. So it's a smaller package.
So it is, but when you're drawing into the gallery and all of that, you are drawing from the county and the surrounding.
Yeah, absolutely. Director Havishell.
Yeah, nothing for you to respond to or solve, but it just strikes me that as the sales of automobiles decline, which I think my theory is, when that 2035 deadline comes around, that will happen. It will have a downstream effect on the fiscal stability of local jurisdictions. Nothing for you to respond to, nothing to be included in here. But as you were presenting that, I was thinking, wow, where is that revenue going to be
for the
replenished?
automobile?
Yeah.
got feedback because you were on.
Oh, yeah, it was probably because I was on. Yeah, I messed you up. Sorry.
But I like the reverb. I like reverb.
Any additional board comment?
We'll end up like Cuba. Everybody's going to be driving 40-year-old cars.
Any, do you have something?
There's no public comment.
Ah,
also.
okay,
I-
perfect.
I just want to, not to be too gloomy to end your meeting, but I just want to, again, reiterate, declining revenue already, even from the last the last transportation plan, MTP SCS. We have more projects coming in, right? The want is more than the available revenue. And so, looking ahead to the next 6 months, this is something that you all as the board are going to have to grapple with is, we still have an appetite for transportation investment that far surpasses our ability to have revenue, even with sales tax measures, even looking relatively positively at the future. And what we don't have coming, we have to go get competitively from the feds.
Yeah, I
Sum it up.
And I should have, just to put a finer point of that, I should have said, just, it's in your staff report, but just to put a little context on that, in the kind of the call for investments that we did with local agencies, we got about $14 billion in requested expansion projects just on the road and highway side. Your current plan has about $6.2 billion. So it's a much larger increase. What we do in that nomination process, it doesn't fully capture all of the needs, right? It doesn't capture all the transit operating needs. It doesn't cover all of the maintenance needs. So it really does focus on kind of those capital investments when we do that. And then we have to go back and look at what the balance of the remaining needs are. And your strategic plan, the current MTP put a huge emphasis on road maintenance and state of good repair. I mentioned earlier, we're about $500 million short a year region-wide on that. Some jurisdictions do better than others, but we all struggle. So I think those are all things that are going to add up to a much bigger price tag than that $37 billion. That number could go up, to Director Bradford's point about when we bring in pricing and tolling. Those are options to bring that number back up. But how much are you going to bring it up to be able to cover all your needs, I think is a big question.
And I would just close by having you all think about, Director Branscombe, you mentioned, and you have been mentioning rightfully, the transit financial situation, right? We could actually expand that to the transportation financial situation. And here's one of the things you'll have to wrestle with is all of the aspirations for us, whether it's highway or transit to expand, we can't afford all of it. We just can't. We're going to have to be real. Now, that doesn't mean we aren't going to do some expansion, right? So we have to be very thoughtful about where that is. And that balance between expansion and maintenance is going to be, more and more in play. It's going to be in play in this plan. So in other words, we can't give everybody light rail. You can't expand it to Roseville and the airport, and you just can't afford it. We also can't afford all our aspirations for highway expansion. We can do some that are strategically thoughtful, right? And we need to do those. And then the other piece is just sort of operations and using intelligent transportation systems and making the existing system work better. So what does that look like on the transit side? It might mean more bus frequency and bus rapid transit rather than light rail everywhere. It's the same thing on the highway side. So that tension is, right, it's just kind of growing as our revenues, as we try to be creative, but they are constrained.
That was our last item. So the only other thing on here is other matters. Thank you. Clint, any general comments or statements from board members? Okay. Well,
one thing, excuse me, Chair Bradford, I have one thing for a reminder for the group. If you haven't done so already, can you please review and submit the executive director's evaluation? If you have any questions, reach out to me or Lynette. She'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great, thank you. I also want to say thanks to Vice Chair Lauren for running the meeting last month when I was not here. And our next meeting is Thursday, June 6th.
Chair, sorry, you finish. Thursday, okay, I got just two quick things. One is your June, not your May, but your June board meeting is going to be in Yuba City. We're excited to come back to Yuba Sutter. It is in downtown Yuba City at the Yuba Sutter Arts and Culture Theater. Full SACOG board. Yep, third Thursday in June. Victoria Cacciatore mentioned we're trying to put together a little something ahead of time. So I'm sure Lynette will send out calendar reminder, in Yuba City, looking at a potential sort of pop-up mobility hub. Your question about what does it look like, stay tuned for that. But we'll be downtown Yuba City at the Yuba Sutter Arts and Culture Theater on Pluma Street, 754 Pluma Street, and that'll be in your calendars. And then all of these questions on transportation, the MTIP, the MTP available revenue, we are going to be doing a lunch for you again between committees. We don't have one this today, but in June, we'll have a lunch around transportation funding and revenue, and just to kind of give you that refresher, if you will, or a primer if you're new. So between the June committees, which is June the 6th, thank you.
Okay. And with that, we will adjourn. Thank you.